Welcome back. So obviously we're getting well into the new year, and in my never-ending attempt to keep things interesting around here, I'm going to try something a little bit different, and that is a head-to-head, track-by-track comparison of two classic albums. In this case, two classic Beatles albums, Sgt. Pepper and Revolver. The thing I like about this, it's definitely not the same thing, and I think a little more interesting than just saying, oh, I prefer this album to this one, and here's why. When you just go down the line and compare track one on this record to track one on this record, there's this luck of the draw involved. And sometimes the decisions are agonizing when two great tracks line up, as they often do. And of course, at the end, we'll tally it all up and see which album was the winner. Although the fun thing about doing it this way is you kind of never know how it's going to come out. I may even be surprised myself at the result. So for the all-important album opening track, for Revolver, we get George Harrison's Taxman. And of course, on Sgt. Pepper, we get the title track. And this one is not at all difficult for me. I'm going to go Taxman all the way. I've always found it to be one of my favorite George Harrison compositions. It rocks in a way that very few Beatles songs do. It's got an amazing guitar solo that appears twice in the middle and the end, played, by the way, by Paul McCartney. A lot of people don't know this. They would assume that it would be George. And also a great bass line from McCartney. He really added a lot to this one. Another thing I love about this one is that it shows us a side of George that we rarely see or hear about. He had this reputation as a sort of guru, an Eastern mystic, not concerned with matters of the material world. And yet here is George complaining about Britain's confiscatory tax rates as he is now a wealthy young man. I think many of us have had that rude awakening when we first start earning a little bit of money, yeah. The lyrics are just brilliant, one great line after another. Now my advice for those who die, declare the pennies on your eyes. That's just really, really clever. Now, Sgt. Pepper, it's okay. It's just never been one of my favorite Beatles songs. Of course, it's essential to the loose concept that is the Sgt. Pepper album. It sets the stage. It's innovative like almost every Beatles track, with the crowd noise that introduces Sgt. Pepper's band. It's a nice mid-tempo rocker, but I'm going to go with the speed and ferocity of Taxman any day. Track 2, we get Eleanor Rigby versus With a Little Help from My Friends. And once again, for me, Revolver is the clear winner here. Eleanor Rigby is so darkly beautiful. I love, for example, that descending passing minor progression during the chorus. E minor 7, E minor 6, E minor augmented fifth to E minor. Sounds like something out of a James Bond film, doesn't it? All the lonely people, where do they all come from? Like another slightly earlier McCartney contribution yesterday, Eleanor Rigby is one of those few Beatle tunes where no Beatle actually plays on the recording. Paul sings, of course, but the only backing is a string octet recorded in a sort of novel way. Engineer Jeff Emmerich loved to get the microphones right up against the instruments, and apparently the classical musicians that they hired to play were not used to that and kept backing away from the microphones. But that technique produces an aggressive, biting sound on the strings that you just don't hear on more traditional classical recordings. Now, here again, the lyrics are phenomenal. They paint a picture of bleakness and despair that I don't think has ever been equaled in pop music. And as mentioned, this song was definitely Paul McCartney's baby, but the lyrics were a real group effort with John, George, and even Ringo contributing. Get this, that great line about Father Mackenzie darning his socks in the night when there's nobody there. Well, that was Ringo's idea. What a beautiful, poignant little detail to add that just completes the picture of loneliness. Now, of course, none of this is to take away from the fact that With a Little Help from My Friends is also a brilliant song, an enduring classic, great vehicle for Joe Cocker, whose version may be even better known these days. John and Paul wrote this one specifically for Ringo, and it's perfect, right within his vocal range. This is probably one of my favorite Ringo vocal performances. Apparently, they made him record it in the wee hours of the morning. He was just getting ready to go home and go to bed, or so he thought. And John and Paul were like, nah, we're going to do this vocal now. And he pulled it off well. And of course, it's brilliant the way Sgt. Pepper segues into With a Little Help from My Friends. That's one of the great innovations of the Sgt. Pepper album, the way one song blends into another. So common nowadays, but not in 1967. Now, as we get to song 3, something I've got to mention. Any Beatles fan will know that the UK and US versions of Beatle albums are sometimes drastically different, and Revolver might be the most extreme example. Bottom line, the US version is lacking 3 songs from the UK version. They just hacked them right off. All 3 Lennon tunes, as it happens. I don't know how he ever allowed that. I'm Only Sleeping, Dr. Robert, and Your Bird Can Sing. Now, in America, those tunes all ended up on the Yesterday and Today album, but that was just a compilation, so it's all really weird. I'll be using the British version today, not only because it's vastly superior, but it's really Revolver the way the Beatles intended it. Bottom line, the matchup we're left with is I'm Only Sleeping for Revolver against Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds on Sgt. Pepper. And this one is really tough. I think both of these tunes are John Lennon at his trippy, psychedelic best, but I think I'm going to give the edge to Lucy in the Sky here. It's definitely become the more iconic tune. I think the sparse arrangement is quite unique. It was a big hit for Elton John in the 1970s, and lyrically, I think it marks the beginning of that sort of Lewis Carroll / Dylan Thomas style of writing that Lennon would employ to great effect in the next couple of years on things like I Am the Walrus. On to track 4, and from Revolver, we get another George Harrison contribution. By the way, the fact that he had 3 of his songs on the Revolver album was a huge deal at the time. That was unheard of up to that point. And from Sgt. Pepper, we get Getting Better. Now, I think Love You Too deserves a lot of credit. It's a very early example of quote-unquote world music in the pop world. In fact, some might argue that it was the first. A writer named Pete Lavazzoli, who wrote a book called The Dawn of Indian Music in the West, described the song as the first conscious attempt in pop to emulate a non-Western form of music in structure and instrumentation. We have the sitar, the tabla drums, the full 9 yards. Musically, it's pretty interesting. The sitar intro, known in Indian music as the alap, is in free time, and then when we get to what's known as the gat section, which is the main body of the piece, there's an abrupt shift in meter. This is probably the first time the Beatles had done something like this in their music. But lyrically, I don't think this is one of George's strongest efforts. Some of the lines, such as make love all day long, make love singing songs, and love me while you can before I'm a dead old man, just seem a little bit clunky, awkward, and dare I say, goofy. Meanwhile, Getting Better is just a lot of fun. I love that guitar ostinato that repeats so insistently throughout almost the whole tune. Some people have told me it's a little bit too insistent for their taste, but I love it. I had a hell of a time for years trying to figure out how that guitar part was played until I realized that it's 2 guitars. McCartney is up top just playing a little G octave on frets 12 and 15. And then down below, George is playing this little F add 9 chord. And the two together sound so cool. This song was primarily McCartney's, but as was so often the case, the rest of the band were throwing in ideas, especially lyrically. In Hunter Davies' famous Beatles book, there's a passage describing the group sitting around a room, throwing out ideas, even Cynthia Lennon getting involved at one point, if I remember correctly. The other thing I love about this one is the way it perfectly encapsulates the stark contrast in personality between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. McCartney, the eternal optimist, I've got to admit it's getting better, and Lennon following quick on his heels. It can't get no worse. Just classic stuff. In the end, I'm going to give round 4 to Sgt. Pepper and Getting Better. A great catchy little tune. And I think that evens up the score. Next up, Here, There, and Everywhere, facing off with Fixing a Hole. Now, Here, There, and Everywhere is just a gorgeous ballad. There's no two ways about it. Paul McCartney himself frequently ranks it among his top few songs that he's ever written. I believe I've seen him rank it as number 1. And Mojo magazine once ranked it at number 4 on their list of greatest songs of all time. Pretty impressive. John and Paul would sometimes tack a little almost a cappella intro onto some of their songs. It's a very old-fashioned move, but I love it. Do You Want to Know a Secret is one example, and this one as well. To lead a better life, I need my love to be here. Also, I love the little key change heading into the middle 8, just brilliantly written. Meanwhile, I really like Fixing a Hole a lot too. I think it's an unusual song for McCartney in that it has a sort of dark, menacing feel, at least it always has to me. Right from that intro, that little harpsichord part, which, depending on who you talk to, was played by McCartney himself or producer George Martin. The wide-open arrangement, the heavy reverb on the vocals, the piercing guitar tone on George Harrison's solo, all of these things contribute to that menacing feel I mentioned. And of course the lyrics too. The narrator sounds like some sort of recluse or misanthrope who just wants to be left alone to his own thoughts and away from all the silly people who want to get past his door. Both great tunes, but I've got to go with Here, There, and Everywhere. Some have criticized it as being cloying or saccharine, but for me, it's one of the prettiest songs ever written. This next matchup is really tough because we've got two songs that couldn't be more different. We have Yellow Submarine going against She's Leaving Home. Now, a lot of people dismiss Yellow Submarine as being silly, but come on, it's a children's tune, and it's one of the most successful children's tunes of all time. Just to give you a little anecdote, many of you know I'm a private music instructor. I started up a 6-year-old on guitar the other day, and he got all excited when I asked him if he wanted to learn Yellow Submarine. Every generation grows up loving this song, which is pretty amazing for a tune that's going to be 60 years old this year. By the way, so is your host, but I don't like to think about that too much. Meanwhile, She's Leaving Home is, I think, a wry comment on the budding hippie culture. Remember, this album was released in June of 1967, so it kind of kicked off the summer of love. The lyrics are about a young girl who runs away from home. She's feeling stifled by her parents and their outdated morality, I guess you would say, from her point of view. I love the call and response thing in the chorus. It's got that great Lennon-McCartney dynamic again. Paul narrates the tale and John plays the role of the parents answering back. We gave her most of our lives, sacrificed most of our lives. We gave her everything money could buy. Well, apparently that wasn't enough. The final verse is interesting. Friday morning at 9 o'clock, she is far away, waiting to keep the appointment she made. meeting a man from the motor trade. Now, some have said that that's a euphemism for an abortionist, which would certainly put an interesting twist onto these lyrics. But as far as I know, McCartney has never confirmed this. Anyway, this is a tough one. I think I'm going to have to go with She's Leaving Home here, just because it's more interesting musically. But that's not to throw shade on Yellow Submarine. I am definitely on Team Yellow Submarine as well. Which brings us to the all-important closing song of side 1. I'm sure many of you will agree with me that that was one of the big bummers about CDs coming in. We lost so much of the importance of sequencing, the importance of how you close side 1, how you start side 2. But I'm going fully old school here. I'm still calling this the end of side 1. Here we get 2 Lennon tracks, She Said versus Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Both great songs and both really very innovative as well. Lennon's inspiration for She Said was an acid trip at which many other luminaries were present. Peter Fonda, members of the Byrds, maybe the Hollies, I'm not sure. The story goes that Peter Fonda started saying, "I know what it's like to be dead," which really creeped Lennon out, but of course served for the opening line of the song. She said, "I know what it's like to be dead. I know what it is to be sad, and she's making me feel like I've never been born." Now, of course, Lennon changed the gender. Typical of him, he loved to obfuscate these kinds of things for some reason. It's very much like Sexy Sadie from the White Album, where he was writing a song about the Maharishi, but turned it into She Made a Fool of Everyone. She Said received high praise from no less a musical authority than Leonard Bernstein, the famed composer, conductor, and musical educator. He praised the tune for what he called its rhythmic and structural innovation. For example, he loved the time signature shift from 4/4 to 3/4 when Lennon enters what I guess you'd call the chorus. I said, "No, no, no, you're wrong," when I was a boy. But Mr. Kite was also way ahead of its time. Lennon's inspiration here famously came from a 19th century circus poster that he found in an antique shop. And when you see that poster, he barely wrote a word of the song. It's all there, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, the Hendersons, the horse that dances the waltz, although maybe the one thing Lennon changed was the name of the horse. It was called Xanthus. But of course, in the song, we get Henry the Horse. I guess that just flowed out the mouth better. The Beatles were constantly exploring new recording techniques around this time. For example, to get that haunted circus sound for this song, they took recordings of fairground organs and calliope music, cut up the tapes, threw the pieces in the air, and then randomly spliced them back together. It's an incredible effect. Once again, this was a really tough one, but I think I'm going to give the edge to Revolver here. And She Said, which takes us on to side 2. And this is going to be a really crazy matchup because the side 2 opening tracks could not be more different. On Revolver, we get Good Day Sunshine, a happy, bouncy little number that was inspired by the Lovin' Spoonful's Daydream. Think about it. Good Day Sunshine is a bit more of a rollicking tune, but they definitely have a similar vibe. It's also really short, maybe a couple of minutes long. Meanwhile, on Sgt. Pepper, we get George Harrison's second full-blown Indian composition, Within You, Without You. Of course, we've already talked about his first, which was on Revolver. This one is a much lengthier, slower, somber, philosophical piece reflecting Harrison's continued interest in Eastern philosophy, although at least one line, that great line about gaining the world and losing your soul, is straight from the New Testament. And I do think Within You, Without You is also really good. The lyrics definitely provide some food for thought. I think George's performance on the sitar is quite competent. Granted, I'm not a great judge of that instrument. And in terms of George's Indian-inspired material, I think this one is a bit more fully realized than Love You Too. But in the end, I'm going to have to go with Good Day Sunshine on this one. It's just a pop masterpiece. And next up is yet another one of these matchups that's so difficult because it's apples to oranges. We get a rocker from John Lennon and Your Bird Can Sing going up against McCartney's whimsical When I'm 64. And Your Bird Can Sing contains what is undoubtedly one of the Beatles' coolest and certainly most complex guitar riffs, a harmony thing played by McCartney and Harrison. I think the riff is really ahead of its time in terms of rock guitar playing. And it's interesting, the band had originally done the song kind of in the style of the Byrds, with jangling 12-string guitars, and then turned it into more of the rocker that it ended up being. It's another one of those great Beatles tunes that clocks in right around 2 minutes, in and out, and leaving you wanting more. They were so good at that. Regarding the riff, I once read an interview with Joe Walsh where he talked about how great it is and claims that he once arranged it for a single guitar, which if you're a guitar player, you'll know that that wouldn't be too easy. When I'm 64 is Paul again at his whimsical best, probably a tune that Lennon and Harrison might have derided as more of Paul's granny music, but I don't care. It's a brilliant track. And get this, it was written apparently when Paul was 14 years old, one of the first songs he ever wrote. Talk about a prodigy. Now, it's easy to dismiss this tune as nostalgia, but it's really not nostalgia because rock and roll hadn't really happened yet when it was written, and Paul had this sort of cabaret feel in mind. Another really fascinating thing about this tune is I think it highlights the differences in the way people look at quote-unquote old age now compared to the way they did even back in the 60s. At that time, especially I imagine if you played in a rock and roll band, 64 was ancient, and there was no question, I think, in people's minds that that life would look very much like what Paul describes in the song, dandling your grandchildren on your knee, puttering around in the garden. And here we are in 2026. Paul is now, 82 or 83, still touring the world and playing rock and roll. Attitudes have really changed over the years, which brings us to crunch time. This one is just so impossible. I think I'm going to cop out here and resort to that age-old solution for making tough decisions, which is flipping a coin. Now, of course, I couldn't find a coin in my house. I mean, who has actual loose change anymore? And then I remembered I had this, an old silver dollar that came to me when my grandfather died, minted in 1921. I know you can't really see much there, but there it is, very cool. So I'm going to flip this thing. My grandfather, by the way, was a coal miner during the Great Depression. How's that for a tough gig? And here I am making YouTube videos. I sometimes wonder what he might think of that. Anyway, here we go. It's going to be heads goes to And Your Bird Can Sing. Tails goes to When I'm 64. Let's see what we get. All right. And it's tails. So Sgt. Pepper for the win. Next we have a Paul on Paul matchup. The beautiful ballad For No One going up against the bouncy, lovely Rita. For No One could be called Baroque pop, another one that clocks in at exactly 2 minutes. It's got a nice key change going from the verse into the chorus. By the way, the other day I saw a graph on the prevalence of key changes in pop music, and for years it was way up here. And then in like the last decade or so, it dips down to practically zero. Just more evidence in case we needed it of how bad pop music is today. For No One features a great French horn solo by a guy called Alan Civil, who Jeff Emmerich described as the best horn player in London at the time. I love how it's used as a standalone solo first and then reappears during the last verse as a counterpoint to Paul's vocal melody. Very cool. Lovely Rita is a lot of fun, of course, written about a real woman, a meter maid who once caught Paul's eye and who I believe is still around. I love how the bulk of the song is very bouncy, but at the end it turns kind of dark with an insistent minor chord and some sort of spooky, almost erotic sounding grunts and gasps. Anyway, it's all very cool, but I gotta give this to For No One. Next, it's John versus John, a couple of typically quirky Lennon compositions, Dr. Robert and Good Morning, Good Morning. I think Dr. Robert is mostly interesting because of the lyrics, which are about a sort of Dr. Feelgood character, the guy that rock stars and others might go to for medications, legal or otherwise. Now, there's doubt as to who the actual Dr. Robert is, if he was a real person at all. Paul has talked about a guy in New York who fit the bill, but the lyrics give us the line, "My friend works for the National Health," which would obviously imply a British subject. Good Morning is fascinating musically in spite of the fact that Lennon's inspiration came from a TV ad for Kellogg's Corn Flakes. There's shifting time signatures, 3/4, 4/4, and 5/4. I love the bridge where it's 4/4 time. You know the part, people running around, it's 5 o'clock, everywhere in town, it's getting dark. It's 4/4 time, but Ringo plays this cool triplet pattern on the cymbals, which makes it feel completely different. I love the blustering horns played by a group called Sounds Incorporated, brought in by George Martin at the request of the Beatles. There's a ripping guitar solo, and guess what? Not George, this is another one played by Paul McCartney. Compare it to the Taxman solo, and you can hear the style. Paul had this really loose, almost sloppy, but in a very cool way, unhinged way of playing lead guitar. It's awesome. By the way, the animal sounds that come in rapid succession near the end, there's chickens, dogs, cats, horses, cows. That was directly inspired by the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album, the animal noises they included at the end of Caroline No, I believe it was. It's no secret that the Beatles and the Beach Boys had this cool sort of friendly rivalry going on right around this time, trying to one-up with the incredible music they were putting out. In the end, these are both great tunes, but I'm going to give the edge to Good Morning, Good Morning. If nothing else, for the pure ambition of it all, there's a lot going on here. Okay, on to track 12. From Revolver, we get George Harrison's third and final contribution, I Want to Tell You. And from Sgt. Pepper, we get the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Reprise. That's yet another of the many innovations on the Sgt. Pepper album. I can't think of a rock album before that had a track which was then reprised later on near the end of the album. Although my audience is great with this stuff. I'm sure if any of you know of one, you'll let me know in the comments. I Want to Tell You is a classic example of something that George Harrison does so often in his music. Now, if you've always thought George Harrison had a unique composing style, but couldn't quite put your finger on what made it so, I can tell you this is a huge part of it. I may have mentioned it elsewhere on my channel, I don't recall. But anyway, when he composes his vocal melodies, he uses a ton of what we call syncopation, which is essentially accenting the upbeats and tending to hold the notes over the downbeats. Let me see if I can illustrate it with a line from I Want to Tell You. Remember the bit, but if I seem to act unkind, it's only me, it's not my mind. Okay, the beat goes 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. You can see clearly here the downbeats versus the upbeats. Notice how the majority of the notes land on the up. But if I seem to act unkind, right? He does this constantly. I've always wondered if it was a conscious decision on George's part or if that was just sort of naturally the way the melodies came out. Sadly, I've never seen any interviews or anything where he discusses it. Now, the Sgt. Pepper Reprise, I've always preferred to the album opening Sgt. Pepper. It's shorter, but it's just got a ton more energy to it. The pace is much faster. Some incredible drumming from Ringo, sampled to great effect by the Beastie Boys. I believe it was on their Paul's Boutique album. And the overall feel is just exhilarating. That's the best word I can think for it. I'm going to give this one to Sgt. Pepper. I just love the energy of this track, even though I'm a big fan of I Want to Tell You as well. Now, of course, throughout the tune, we get that canned crowd noise, which was present on the original Sgt. Pepper. And that crowd noise segues beautifully into Sgt. Pepper's final track, which is one of their greatest of all time. I'm referring, of course, to A Day in the Life, the brilliant collaboration between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Two separate tunes, very incongruous seemingly, but melded together beautifully. I mean, where do I even begin with this one? So many innovations here. The way they fuse those parts together with the orchestral buildup, Paul instructing the players in the orchestra to start on their lowest note and then gradually work their way up to their highest note at their own pace. The effect is amazing. I, to this day, can't listen to it without feeling my heart rate start to accelerate. I think John's part in particular is amazing. It's really mostly his song. It's so starkly beautiful, mostly just his voice with very little backing. It's an incredible vocal performance soaked in a beautiful reverb that really heightens the effect. It sounds apocalyptic. That's about the best way I can describe it. One writer said it was the oral equivalent of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. The Revolver contribution is no slouch either. It's Paul's Got to Get You Into My Life, which was his take on a sort of Motown sound, although one writer described it as more Haight-Ashbury than Motown. Don't know if I agree with that, but I kind of get the sentiment. Now, the Beatles definitely used horns a bit. We've talked about it already. Although the date of this recording session, May 18th, 1966, makes it the first time the group used horns on a recording. Great vocal from Paul, too. I think he's actually underrated as a vocalist, if it's possible for a Beatle to be underrated in anything. Great tune, but as you could probably guess, I got to go with A Day in the Life here. There are very few songs that would beat that one in my book. I suspect some of you have already anticipated the quandary I'm in right now. With A Day in the Life, the Sgt. Pepper album is over, and Revolver still has one track to go, Lennon's Tomorrow Never Knows. So here's what I'm going to do. When the Beatles convened at the recording studio in November of 1966 to begin the Sgt. Pepper sessions, the first song they recorded was Strawberry Fields Forever. That, of course, ended up being part of that incredible double A-sided single, Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever, which preceded the Sgt. Pepper album. It came out in February of 67, and as mentioned, Sgt. Pepper came out in June. And can I just say here, this is a classic illustration of just how unbelievable and otherworldly the Beatles' output was during this time. I mean, they get together to record an album. They record this incredible single, which is arguably the greatest pop single of all time. Then they don't bother to even put those two amazing songs on the album. They go on to record a bunch more, and we get Sgt. Pepper. Imagine how much more incredible Sgt. Pepper would have been with those two songs included. Even without those tracks, Sgt. Pepper still routinely ranks at number one on rankings of the best rock albums of all time. Usually it's either that, maybe Pet Sounds. I think I've even seen Revolver at number 1 before. Anyway, I think you can all see where I'm headed with this. I'm going to put Strawberry Fields up against Tomorrow Never Knows, a couple of great Lennon tunes, and we'll see where it goes. I've always loved the dreamy quality of Strawberry Fields. It's John reminiscing about his childhood in Liverpool. The recording process was so complex. They recorded multiple versions. John decided he liked the beginning of one take and the ending of another take, but famously they were in different keys and at different speeds. George Martin said, that's impossible to splice the two together. John said, I'm sure you'll come up with something, and went off to get a cup of tea, as the story goes. And sure enough, Martin and Jeff Emmerich managed to work it out. So the key is actually weird. I believe it's somewhere in between A and B flat, kind of in the cracks there. Let's just assume we're in A. So we get that great intro with a passing progression. E major 7th, E 7th, and so on. And then the verse begins on A. Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields. A to E minor 7. Now, that sounds like a Mixolydian cadence to me. The major 1 and the minor 5. This is my favorite chord of the whole thing coming next. The drop dead chord. Strawberry Fields. Nothing is real. F sharp 7. We're going to call that a secondary dominant. It's the 5 of the 2 chord, the 2 chord here being B minor. Now, a secondary dominant will often resolve to its 1 chord, which is the B minor here, but this one does not. It goes up to the 4 chord D, and then back to the F sharp 7, and then the little chorus. 4 chord again, this time it's a major 7th. Strawberry Fields forever. And then to the 1. The 4 resolving to 1 is what we call a plagal cadence. It makes the whole thing a bit more ambiguous. But Tomorrow Never Knows is really impressive too. Like Strawberry Fields, it literally changed people's idea of what pop music could be. Lyrics based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. All kinds of recording innovations. On the final verse, we get John singing through a Leslie organ speaker, which gives it that faraway sound. He said famously he wanted it to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting on a mountaintop. This effect has been done to death in the years since. And then there's the fact that the whole thing is 1 chord and Lennon's trance-like vocal droning on top. But it doesn't get boring, not by a long shot. To this day, whenever I listen to this thing, I'm left thinking how far ahead of its time it still sounds 60 years later. Another brutally tough decision, but I think in the end I have to go with Strawberry Fields. I think it has the edge in terms of pure musicality. Which brings us to the moment of truth. Now, I hadn't really been keeping score as I went along, so I was really intrigued to see the result. The final tally, Revolver 6, Sgt. Pepper 8. Now, I knew these would be really, really close. I mean, 2 landmark albums. It's funny, if you had asked me before this which album I preferred, I probably would have chosen Revolver. But as I've said, that's the way it goes with this method. Sometimes you're a little bit surprised. And of course, Sgt. Pepper benefited from the coin toss. I had to add an extra track to make the albums come out even. So bottom line, as you would probably expect, these albums are just about a dead heat. So that's it for now. I had a lot of fun doing this format, and I'd like to do more in this style if you guys are into it. Obviously, I would also love to see your track-by-track matchups in the comments. And of course, if you're so inclined and you enjoy the channel, financial contributions are very much appreciated. I had a couple very generous contributions recently for which I am eternally grateful. Buy me a coffee, Venmo, PayPal, Zelle, all the usual stuff. We'll talk soon.